So in this video, we're going to take an introduction to Enlightenment political philosophy and have a look at Thomas Hobbes and his theory of the state of nature. Okay, so we're going to take an introduction to Thomas Hobbes himself, where his sort of political philosophy led and where it went to, and how he came to those conclusions based on the period in history he lived, and then look at his theory of the state of nature, which is almost a theory against anarchism, effectively. Okay, so first we have an introduction to Thomas Hobbes. He was a 17th century English philosopher and is now regarded as one of the greatest political philosophers of the Enlightenment age. His most significant work in political philosophy, at least, was probably his Leviathan. Okay, and it is argued that Leviathan is one of the most significant pieces of political writings in history. Okay, and so in this we're going to look at the principles from his political theories. Okay, mainly looking at aspects of Leviathan. Okay, and then we're going to move on to other political philosophers like Locke and Rousseau. Okay, so for example, his theory of state of nature and social contract are examples of the different theories in politics that we're going to look at here. So what is the state of nature? So really, when it comes to his rationale for the state of nature, Hobbes wants to find principles for the construction of civil politics. Okay? And he lived through a period of quite significant turmoil. He lived through the English Civil War. And so he saw firsthand of the scale of what he would call political disintegration, the kind of political disintegration that was even possible, okay? The way in which politics can almost collapse in times of war, in times of civil war. And he came to the opinion that the burdens of even the most oppressive governments are, in his account, are scarce sensible in respect of the miseries and horrible calamities that accompany civil war. Okay, so it's spelt differently because that's how it's spelt in Leviathan. Okay, so he came to the conclusion really quite early on in his reasoning that even the most oppressive governments aren't as bad as civil war. Okay, so they're scarce in respect of the calamities of a civil war. So he effectively concluded that government is better than civil war. So as you can imagine, Hobbes took to see the English Civil War as in a very negative light. He saw the Civil War as a negative part of history. Okay, and it's for this reason that it's important to view Hobbes' political philosophy through this lens, because it does have a big impact on how he viewed abstract political concepts. Okay, that's important to note. Okay, because you can't just take, if you want to really examine the political philosophy of these Enlightenment thinkers, you can't just do it through just blatantly reading and trying to interpret what they're saying. You have to sort of view it through the lens that they're coming through. Okay, that's why the background of Thomas Hobbes is very important, because if you didn't know that he was alive during the Civil War, you might come to think that his conclusions are quite strange. But because if we view it through the lens that he wrote it through, then we seem to understand what he's trying to say. Okay, so in general, Hobbes aimed to demonstrate the reciprocal relationship between political obedience and peace. So he wanted to show that if you are obedient to the state's political obedience, then that generally leads to a peaceful outcome. So to find conclusions to Hobbes' core arguments, he invites us to consider an interesting thought experiment, and this is the state of nature. Okay, so what would life be like in a state of nature? And by that he means, what would life be like? What would it be like to live in a condition without government, without the state? So effectively a stateless nation. And Hobbes says this condition is the condition of mere nature. So the condition of what it was like before government even develops. Okay, and you can probably imagine what his view was on this issue anyway. Okay, so he argued that such a desolate condition of masterless men without subjection to laws and a coercive power to tie their hands from rapine and revenge. Okay, it's quite hard to read these Enlightenment thinkers sometimes with their stupid spellings. So this is really the most famous part of Leviathan when it comes to his theory of the state of nature. So Hobbes suggested that there'd be no place for industry because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as to require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Okay, when it comes to looking at Thomas Hobbes, most people sum up his theory of the state of nature as being nasty, brutish, and short. That's why I put it in bold. But Thomas Hobbes seems to make the argument quite clearly here that if we were to live in a stateless world, a world without a government or a state, okay, there would be not much of anything. Okay, he says there's not even an account of time or arts or letters. Okay, none of these would exist in a state of nature. So really, for Hobbes, it's very simple. He believed that this idea of the state of nature, and this is the idea that this is the idea of the state of nature, and thus people should aim to try and avoid the state of nature. So people shouldn't be advocating for a removal of the state or for drawing back of state power. And as a result of this, he argues against anarchism. Since anarchism is a belief in an abolition of government, he argues for the implementation of a strong state, because otherwise the state of nature wouldn't be very nice, according to Hobbes. There are a number of responses that we can think of here, a number of implications to look at, and we will look at different responses in later videos on Locke and Rousseau, because Locke and Rousseau have different responses to this idea of a state of nature. They seem to view it in a little bit more of a positive light than Hobbes does. Okay, so many interpret Hobbes' ideas as a bit too pessimistic and overly negative, as you can probably imagine. However, it can be said that this argument doesn't really hold much water, since Hobbes does construct his views from a number of empirical assumptions. Okay, so he makes the assumption that people are sufficiently similar so that no one makes invulnerable nor can expect to be able to dominate others. Okay, Hobbes argues that on the whole, people's benevolence is limited. So he makes his argument for this view of the state of nature based on assumptions about society and how people in society act, and how sort of the psychology of people works within societies. Okay, and so really in the next video we're going to look a little bit more at Thomas Hobbes and the state of nature, and then move on to look at other things that he talked about. But for now, these are the notes and references. Go to the website learningacademy2020.co.uk if you want to see some extra information, extra notes that I've put up there. Okay, and maybe I might even put up some quiz questions if you want to test yourself on different theories of the state of nature. Okay, so that's all going to be on the website. Okay, I'll link the website down below. Okay, if you want to watch the next video, it should be available shortly.